U.S. locked and loaded to strike Syria again if there's another chemical attack, Haley says. The United States, France and Britain launched military strikes in Syria to punish President Bashar Assad for an apparent chemical attack against civilians and to deter him from doing it again. Follow along for the latest updates. Overnight strikes. The United States and Russia blamed each other Saturday for heightened international tensions after US, UK and French strikes against targets in Syria over the alleged use of chemical weapons. As leaders of the three Western allies exchanged calls declaring the strikes a success against future use of illegal munitions, the US and Russian ambassadors to the United Nations pointed fingers during an emergency session of the UN Security Council. The overnight strikes hit three sites, one in Damascus and two in Homs, which President Donald Trump said were associated with the chemical weapon capabilities of Syrian dictator Bashar al-Assad. The United States remains locked and loaded to strike Syria again in response to new chemical attacks, said Nikki Haley, the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, who accused Russia, a key Syrian ally, of covering up for the Assad government. The pictures of dead children were not fake news, she told the Security Council. They were the result of the Syrian regime's barbaric inhumanity. Defiant Russia's resolution rejected. The UN Security Council has rejected a Russian resolution calling for condemnation of the aggression by the United States and its allies against Syria. Only three countries, Russia, China and Bolivia, voted in favor of the resolution at the end of an emergency meeting of the 15-member council called by Russia on Saturday. 8 countries voted against and 3 abstained. A resolution needs at least 9 yes votes to be approved. The vote reflected the deep divisions in the UN's most powerful body, which has been paralyzed in dealing with the 7-year Syrian conflict and chemical weapons use in the country. UN Security Council meets. The UN Security Council met regarding the strikes in Syria, with U.S. Ambassador to the UN Nikki Haley slamming the Assad regime and Russia for supporting the leader. The time for talk ended last night, Haley said. We are prepared to sustain this pressure, if the Syrian regime is foolish enough to test our will. When our president draws a red line, our president enforces a red line. Russia's UN ambassador labeled the coalition strikes as an illegal military adventure. As the two sides traded barbs, UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres urged an end to military action and a turn to diplomacy. Syria today represents the most serious threat to international peace and security, Guterres said. There is no military solution to the crisis. The solution must be political. Disinformation campaign begins. A Pentagon official said a Russian disinformation campaign has already begun over the US-led airstrikes in Syria. Chief Pentagon spokeswoman Dana White said, there has been a 2,000% increase in Russian trolls in the past 24 hours. Russia's foreign ministry says the attack was an attempt to derail an investigation into a purported chemical attack. The foreign ministry says facts presented by Russian investigators indicated that the purported attack was a premeditated and cynical sham. Precise, overwhelming and effective. In a Saturday morning briefing at the Pentagon, officials detailed the overnight strikes in Syria, which, they said, successfully hit 3 chemical weapons facilities. Lieutenant General Kenneth McKenzie, director of the Joint Staff, said 105 missiles were fired by the coalition nations. He described the results as precise, overwhelming and effective. This is going to set the Syrian chemical weapons program back for years, McKenzie said. McKenzie said the targeted sites were a research and development center, a chemical weapons storage site and a chemical weapons bunker. While Syria has claimed it shot down missiles, McKenzie said no aircraft or missiles were engaged by Syrian military forces in the strike. He added that he is not aware of any civilian casualties, but Syria fired missiles trying to intercept coalition missiles. That's part of this equation, too, he said. A report on Syrian state-run television said there were at least 3 people wounded. McKenzie said the strike was twice the size of a similar operation in 2017 after another apparent chemical attack by the Assad regime. Pentagon spokesperson Dana White said the attacks haven't changed the U.S. policy and the nation focused on destroying ISIS. She said the strikes were a response to violations of international law. It's intolerable for any civilized nation to tolerate the use of chemical weapons, White said. Trump hails perfectly executed strike. President Donald Trump declared the overnight airstrikes as perfectly executed in a morning tweet. "Thank you to France and the United Kingdom for their wisdom and the power of their fine military," he said. "Could not have had a better result. Mission accomplished." The president also touted the big boost to Pentagon spending included in a recently passed budget bill. "So proud of our great military, sick, which will soon be, after the spending of billions of fully approved dollars, the finest that our country has ever had. There won't be anything, or anyone, even close." Support and denial. Western allies showed support for US, UK and French strikes against chemical weapons targets in Syria, but Syrian military forces said most missiles were intercepted by the country's defense systems. The Syrian armed forces said in a statement that 110 missiles were fired on Syrian targets and that the country's defense systems intercepted most of the missiles, but some hit targets including the research center in Bars. Turkey, an important player in the Syrian conflict, said it viewed the airstrikes as an appropriate response to the Douma attack that killed scores of people. Germany and Australia also expressed support of the three countries' airstrikes. Iran leader calls US-led strike military crime. Iran's state-run IRNA news agency said Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei has called the US-led airstrikes on Syria military crime. He spoke at a meeting with Iranian officials and ambassadors from some Islamic countries. The report quotes Khamenei as calling the leaders of the United States, Britain and France, the countries that launched the attack, criminals. The Allies' operation was intended to punish Syrian President Bashar Assad for an apparent chemical attack against civilians and to deter him from doing it again. "We are confident of its success," UK's Prime Minister says. UK Prime Minister Theresa May explained Saturday why her country, France and the US launched airstrikes against Syria. "While a full assessment of this strike is ongoing, we are confident of its success," she said. May also said that the UK worked with allies to establish what happened. She said all indications of an April 7 attack show it's a chemical attack. The World Health Organization also reported hundreds of people showed signs and symptoms consistent with toxic chemicals, May said. Scores of people, including women and children, died after the April 7 attack. Putin, attack on Syria act of aggression. Russian President Vladimir Putin has denounced a strike on Syria launched by the United States and its allies as an act of aggression that will exacerbate humanitarian catastrophe in Syria. In a statement issued by the Kremlin, the Russian leader said Moscow is calling an emergency meeting of the United Nations Security Council over the strike launched by the US, Britain and France. Putin added that the strike had a destructive influence on the entire system of international relations. He reaffirmed Russia's view that a purported chemical attack in the Syrian town of Douma that prompted the strike was a fake. Putin added that Russian military experts who inspected Douma found no trace of the attack. He criticized the US and its allies for launching the strike without waiting for inspectors from the International Chemical Weapons Watchdog to visit the area. Meanwhile, the Russian military said Syrian air defense units downed 71 out of 103 cruise missiles launched by the US and its allies. Russia, missiles aimed at Syrian air base downed. The Russian military said Syria's Soviet-made air defense systems have shot down all 12 cruise missiles aimed at the Syrian air base. The Russian Defense Ministry said that 12 cruise missiles were launched at the Dumer air base east of Damascus. It said that Syria's air defense assets have downed all of them. The ministry said altogether more than 100 cruise and air-to-ground missiles were launched by US, British and French aircraft and Navy ships. It did not mention the overall number of missiles intercepted by Syrian forces. The Russian military said it hasn't engaged its air defense assets at its air and naval bases in Syria. "We are your men, Bashar," hundreds celebrate in Syria's capital. Hundreds of Syrians are demonstrating in a landmark square of the Syrian capital, waving victory signs and honking their car horns in a show of defiance. The demonstrations broke out early Saturday following a wave of US, British and French military strikes to punish President Bashar Assad for a suspected chemical attack against civilians. The Syrian government has denied the accusations. In Damascus, the president's seat of power, hundreds of residents gathered in Umayyad Square, many waving Syrian, Russian and Iranian flags. Some clapped their hands and danced, others drove in convoys, honking their horns. "We are your men, Bashar," they shouted. State TV broadcasted live from the square where a large crowd of civilians mixed with men in uniforms, including an actor, lawmakers and other figures. "Good morning steadfastness," one broadcaster said. UK, initial indications show successful attack on military facility. The British Defence Ministry said 4 of its Tornado GR4 warplanes fired missiles at a military facility as part of the tripartite attack on Syria. The ministry said the missiles were fired around 15 miles west of Homs, where it was assessed the Syrian regime keeps agents used to make chemical weapons. The ministry said in a statement Saturday that the warplanes struck the former missile base with Storm Shadow missiles after very careful analysis to maximize the destruction of stockpiled chemicals and to minimize any risk of contamination to the surrounding area. It said the facility is located some distance from any known concentration of civilian residential areas. The ministry said a detailed analysis of the strike's effectiveness is continuing, but initial indications show a successful attack. Syrian TV says 3 wounded in US-led missile strike on military base. Syrian state-run TV said 3 civilians have been wounded in the US-led missile attack on a military base in Homs. It said the attack was aborted by derailing the incoming missile but that 3 people were wounded. It said another attack with a number of missiles targeting a scientific research center destroyed a building and caused other material damage but no human losses. The network said the building in the research center included an educational center and labs.